It's Halloween tonight, and for my Halloween special, I wanted to bring you a true classic, the story that still defines real-life horror. Ed Gein, the man who made his furniture out of women's skin. I've spent years reading about real-life monsters, but none have haunted me like Ed Gein. In the quiet town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, he lived alone in a decaying farmhouse filled with horrors no one could imagine. What started as a lonely man's obsession with death turned into something far darker. Furniture made of human skin, masks crafted from the faces of women he admired, and a chilling devotion to his dead mother. As I dug into his story, I realized this wasn't just about murder. It was about madness, isolation, and the terrifying ways the human mind can twist when left alone in the dark. There's something unsettling about small towns. You know, the kind where everyone knows each other's names, where life moves at the pace of the wind brushing through the cornfields. Plainfield, Wisconsin, was one of those places. Back then, in the early 1900s, it was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes secrets easy to bury. That's where Ed Gein grew up. Just a boy, born in 1906, on a farm surrounded by miles of empty fields. From the outside, the Gein family looked like any other, hard-working, isolated, ordinary. But behind closed doors, their home was a place of fear and worship twisted together. His mother, Augusta, ruled with a Bible in one hand and judgment in the other. She told Ed that women were wicked, that sin lived in every heart but hers. And he believed her. He worshipped her as if she were a god. His father, George, was a drunk, angry, weak, and mean when the bottle ran dry. The kind of man who beat his sons more out of frustration than discipline. Ed didn't hate him, though. He just learned early on that love was punishment and silence was survival. When Ed was 9, the family moved to a 155-acre farm on the edge of town. An island of rotting wood and isolation. Augusta liked it that way. No neighbors, no outsiders, no contamination from the world she despised. She pulled her boys out of school whenever she could and preached her gospel of sin and damnation instead, for hours, for years. The locals said Ed was odd but harmless, a quiet kid with downcast eyes who laughed at the wrong times and stared too long. He had no friends. Augusta didn't allow them. So Ed learned to talk to himself, to the animals, to the voices that filled the long, empty nights of the farm. When his father died in 1940, Augusta's control became absolute. Ed, now in his 30s, was her shadow. Every word she spoke carved itself into his mind like scripture. His brother Henry tried to break free. He had a woman, a job, a plan for life beyond the farm. But Ed didn't like that. Henry questioned their mother's goodness. And for Ed, that was blasphemy. Then, one spring day in 1944, a brush fire got out of control on their property. When it was over, Henry was dead. They said it was smoke inhalation. But the bruises on his head told another story. No one asked too many questions. Plainfield wasn't the kind of town that liked questions. After that, it was just Ed and Augusta, until 1945, when she had a stroke and died. Her death shattered him. It wasn't just grief. It was the death of his God, his keeper, his only tether to the world. The farmhouse fell silent. Dust gathered on her furniture. Cobwebs stretched across her bedroom door, and Ed sealed it shut like a tomb. He'd spend the next decade trying to fill the void she left behind. And what filled that void was unspeakable. After Augusta Gein's death in 1945, the old farmhouse in Plainfield went quiet. Too quiet. Her voice, that booming, righteous echo that had filled every corner of the house, was gone. And for Ed, that silence was unbearable. He sealed her bedroom like a shrine, locking the door and leaving everything untouched. Her Bible still open on the nightstand, her crucifix above the bed, and the lace curtains yellowing with age. The rest of the house, though, began to rot around him. Dust, filth, animal carcasses, and newspapers piled high until there was barely a path through the rooms. He lived surrounded by decay, but that one locked room stayed immaculate, pure. Without Augusta, Ed lost his anchor. He became a man adrift, wandering through life as though waiting for instructions from a ghost. By day, he did odd jobs for neighbors, fixing fences or helping with harvests. People said he was polite, maybe a little strange, but harmless. Some even trusted him enough to babysit their kids. And in the evenings, when the lights went out across Plainfield, Ed sat alone under the weak glow of an oil lamp. Reading. He read obsessively, anatomy textbooks, true crime magazines, and pulp stories about cannibals and Nazi experiments. He studied them like holy texts. One name seemed to stick with him, Ilse Koch, the woman accused of making lampshades from human skin in a concentration camp. He read that story over and over, the words scratching something deep inside him. But reading wasn't enough. Eventually, Ed started visiting the cemetery at night. He claimed it happened in a trance, that he'd drive to the graveyard without remembering how he got there. Sometimes, he said, he'd wake up sitting in the car and just drive home. Other times, he didn't stop himself. He dug up the bodies of recently buried women who reminded him of his mother, middle-aged, full-figured, with strong features. He opened their coffins, removed what he wanted, and took them home. He tanned their skin, experimented, and began crafting things. At first, it was small. A skull turned into a bowl, a strip of skin stretched over a chair. But it grew. The boundaries between grief, worship, and madness disappeared. He wasn't trying to destroy his mother's memory. He was trying to recreate her, to bring her back piece by piece. Neighbors started noticing the smell around the Gein place. They said it was probably just bad meat or dead animals. Plainfield was used to odd odors. No one thought much of it. But behind those boarded windows, Ed was building a collection. Masks made from human faces, lampshades of flesh, gloves, belts, corsets. He was practicing taxidermy on people. And in the quiet of that farmhouse, he was planning something bigger. Something that would finally let him become what he had lost. He called it his woman suit. By the winter of 1954, the town of Plainfield had grown used to Ed Gein's oddities. They saw him as that quiet bachelor who did small jobs. Always polite, never angry, just strange. He'd sit alone at the local tavern sometimes, nursing a beer, smiling awkwardly at conversation he didn't really understand. Nobody feared him. In a town where everyone knows everyone, evil never feels close until it knocks on your own door. That door belonged to Mary Hogan. She ran a small tavern in Pine Grove, a few miles from Plainfield, the kind of place where regulars talked about deer season and the latest gossip. Mary was nothing like Ed Gein. She was loud, bold, and unapologetically alive. She swore, she drank, and she didn't care what people thought. In every way that Augusta despised, Mary Hogan embodied everything Ed had been taught to hate. And yet, something about her drew him in. He'd stop by her bar now and then, sitting quietly in the corner, just watching her. She didn't notice him much, just another face among the regulars. But in Ed's mind, Mary wasn't just another woman. She was temptation, a test, maybe even a substitute for his mother's ghost. On December 8th, 1954, the snow was falling hard over Pine Grove. The air was heavy, the kind that muffles sound and makes even small towns feel deserted. That morning, Mary was alone at her tavern. By evening, she was gone. When a local stopped by, he found blood on the floor, a dark, heavy pool near the bar, and a spent .32 caliber cartridge on the ground. The cash register was open, but the money was still there. A trail of blood led out the back door into the snow. Mary Hogan had vanished. The police searched the area, but found nothing. No footprints beyond the back door. No signs of robbery. No body. Just that blood. And a silence that felt too still for comfort. For 3 years, the disappearance of Mary Hogan was one of those unsolved mysteries people in small towns whisper about over coffee. The story never quite faded. It lingered, like the echo of something unfinished. And then there was Ed. Every now and then, he'd say things that made people uncomfortable. When talk of Mary's disappearance came up at the tavern or in the hardware store, he'd smirk and say, "She's not missing. She's down at the farm." People laughed it off. They thought he was joking. That was just Ed, the quiet, weird guy who told morbid jokes and helped you fix your fence. Nobody believed him. But he wasn't joking, because by then, Mary Hogan's body was already gone, her head severed, her skin preserved, and her face kept carefully folded in a paper bag. For Ed, the line between the grave and the living had vanished. Grave robbing wasn't enough anymore. He'd crossed into something darker, the thrill of power, of control, of capturing life before it escaped him again. Investigators would later find her remains in his farmhouse, almost 3 years later. They'd open a paper bag and find her face, pale, leathery, with strands of black hair still attached, staring back at them when questioned. Ed confessed with that same eerie calm that chilled every officer who met him. He said he shot her with a pistol in her tavern and dragged her body home. No rage, no panic, just curiosity. And when they asked him why, Ed said he didn't know. He just wanted to keep her close. That's the terrifying thing about people like Ed Gein. There isn't always a reason. Sometimes madness doesn't shout or announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly at the bar, smiles, and waits until no one's looking. For 3 years, the town of Plainfield carried on as if nothing had happened. The snow melted, the seasons changed, and life went on. But under that same gray sky, Ed's farmhouse grew darker, because Mary Hogan was only the beginning. By the winter of 1957, Plainfield had settled into its usual rhythm, slow, quiet, predictable. It was the opening day of deer hunting season, November 16th, when most of the town was out in the woods. It was one of those mornings when the cold bites hard, the streets are empty, and every sound echoes twice as loud against the frost. In her small hardware store on Main Street, Bernice Worden was working alone. She was 58 years old, a widow, the kind of woman everyone in town trusted. People said she had a warm smile and the patience to help you find just the right bolt or tool from the shelves. Her son, Frank Worden, was the deputy sheriff. That morning, she wrote her last sales receipt, 1 gallon of antifreeze. The name on it was Ed Gein. Sometime after 9:30 a.m., the store went silent. When evening came and Bernice still hadn't returned home, Frank grew uneasy. He drove to the store, expecting to find her working late. But what he saw inside would change his life forever. The lights were still on. The cash register drawer hung open, coins scattered across the counter, and on the wooden floor behind the counter was a dark, sticky pool of blood. A blood trail led out the back door, across the frozen ground, and vanished in the snow. Frank knew instantly something terrible had happened. He called for backup, and the small police force of Plainfield began a frantic search. Someone mentioned seeing Ed Gein's old Ford truck parked outside that morning, just around the time Bernice disappeared. Frank remembered the antifreeze receipt in the register with Gein's name. Everything pointed to the quiet, awkward handyman who lived alone on the edge of town. When officers found Ed that evening, he wasn't hiding. He was calmly walking out of a grocery store in West Plainfield, dressed in his worn work jacket, his face expressionless. When asked where he'd been that day, Ed answered softly, "Just out running errands." They arrested him on the spot. Meanwhile, a search team made their way toward his property, a lonely, sagging farmhouse standing on the edge of a dark field. The wind was sharp that night, rattling the old barn doors as the men approached. Their flashlights cut through the cold mist, catching the skeletal outlines of machinery and junk piled high in the yard. No one could have prepared for what waited inside. Deputy Sheriff Art Schley led the team through the back door. The moment they stepped inside, the stench hit them, thick, heavy, unmistakable. Death. It clung to everything, the floorboards, the walls, the very air they breathed. The house was filthy beyond imagination. Rotten food, piles of newspapers, tools, and junk everywhere. But as they moved deeper in, what they found stopped them cold. Out in the summer kitchen, hanging from the rafters, was a body, Bernice Worden, headless, hanging upside down by her ankles, her wrists tied with rope, her torso split open from the groin to the sternum, dressed out like a deer. The body had been gutted, drained of blood. Her head was missing. Every man in that room froze. These were hunters, farmers, and officers who'd seen death before. But nothing like this. One of them dropped his flashlight. Another stepped outside to vomit in the snow. Sheriff Schley stood still for almost a full minute, unable to speak. When they recovered, the search continued, and each room they entered revealed something worse. Inside, the farmhouse was a museum of nightmares, human skulls, some cut into bowls, chairs upholstered in human skin, a lampshade made of a woman's face, a belt sewn from nipples. Masks of human skin hung on the walls, like grotesque trophies. In one corner, they found Bernice Worden's head in a burlap sack, her face frozen in a look of horror. Her heart lay in a plastic bag near the stove, as if it had been waiting to be cooked, and in a paper bag on a nearby table, the face of Mary Hogan, the woman who had vanished 3 years earlier. It was too much for the officers to process. Even hardened investigators later admitted that what they saw inside that farmhouse never left them. Some said they couldn't sleep for months. Others quit law enforcement altogether. When they confronted Ed with what they found, he didn't flinch. He sat in his cell quietly, almost relieved that it was over. "I guess you found everything," he said. Under questioning, he admitted to killing Bernice Worden, saying he had shot her in the store with his .22 rifle. He also confessed to Mary Hogan's murder, but when they asked him about the other body parts, the countless remains scattered through his home, Ed said most of them came from the graveyard. He claimed he would go there at night, in a daze, and dig up the bodies of women who reminded him of his mother. The truth was even worse than anyone expected. Over the next few days, investigators realized that Ed Gein had desecrated dozens of graves in Plainfield Cemetery, robbing them of the dead. His home contained remains from at least 10 different women. The newspapers called him the Butcher of Plainfield. The locals preferred the Plainfield Ghoul. In a town where people never locked their doors, everything changed overnight. The Gein farmhouse was sealed off, guarded by state police. Reporters swarmed the streets, and strangers came from miles away, hoping to see the place for themselves. For a brief moment, Plainfield became the center of the world's nightmares. When Sheriff Schley was asked what it was like inside that house, he said only one thing. It didn't feel like we were walking through a home. It felt like we were walking through someone's mind. When word spread that night about what the officers had found, Plainfield froze. News traveled fast in small towns, but no one could have imagined this. A handyman, a neighbor, the man who fixed your roof or babysat your kids, had turned his farmhouse into a slaughterhouse. Phones rang through the night. Lights flickered on across quiet streets. Families double-checked their doors, even though they'd never locked them before. For the first time, Plainfield didn't feel safe. At the Waushara County Jail, Ed sat in a small, dimly lit cell. His hands were cuffed, his demeanor calm, almost detached. Sheriff Art Schley and a few investigators gathered around him, their faces pale with disbelief. They wanted answers, not just to what Ed had done, but why. When they asked about Bernice Worden, Ed didn't deny it. He said it matter-of-factly, like someone describing how to fix a fence. He admitted to shooting her with his rifle, then dragging her body to his truck. "It was an accident," he said softly. "The gun just went off." No one believed that. When the conversation turned to Mary Hogan, he nodded again. "Yeah, Mary's around here somewhere," he murmured, almost wistful. The officers couldn't understand it. The lack of emotion, the absence of guilt. One detective described him later as a man who spoke about death like someone describing a grocery list. Another said he didn't look like a killer. He looked like a lost boy who'd done something he couldn't quite explain. After hours of questioning, Ed began to talk more freely. He told them about the nights after his mother died, when he couldn't sleep, when the loneliness felt like it was eating through his bones. He said he'd hear her voice sometimes, calling to him, scolding him, guiding him. He said he went to the cemetery to be closer to her, and sometimes he brought things home. When the investigators asked what he did with those things, Ed hesitated. "I made things," he said quietly, "things I could use." The officers exchanged looks. One asked, "Like what?" He shrugged. "Stuff for the house." No one in that room could have imagined what that meant. Outside the jail, Plainfield became a living nightmare. Reporters poured in from across the country. Photographers camped near the property lines, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous farmhouse. The town's single diner overflowed with journalists, strangers, and locals whispering about what they'd seen, or what they'd heard. The sheriff's office was bombarded with phone calls. Some were from nearby towns, warning that other graves had been disturbed. Others were from families demanding to know if their loved ones' bodies were among those taken. The fear spread fast. Plainfield Cemetery became the site of round-the-clock police patrols. People drove out there just to stare at the rows of graves, wondering which ones Ed had touched. Some families even exhumed their relatives' remains to make sure they were still there. Meanwhile, at the Gein farmhouse, the inventory of horror continued. State investigators documented every item, every artifact, with meticulous care. It wasn't a crime scene anymore. It was an autopsy of a man's mind. Each day brought a new revelation. More bones, more skin, more evidence of the unthinkable. When Sheriff Schley returned to the jail to confront Ed with what they'd catalogued, something inside him snapped. He slammed Gein's head against the wall during questioning, not out of hatred, but sheer revulsion. That moment would later end Schley's career. He suffered a breakdown and a heart attack within a decade. Friends saying he was never the same after seeing inside that house. The papers couldn't get enough of it. The Milwaukee Journal called Ed the Ghoul of Plainfield. Others dubbed him the Mad Butcher. For a time, his name appeared on front pages next to atomic bomb tests and the Cold War. A reminder that horror wasn't just something that happened overseas. It could live in a farmhouse down the road. But for the people of Plainfield, it wasn't sensational. It was personal. They'd bought eggs from him, shared meals with him, even trusted him with their children. One local woman told a reporter, "I used to see him at church every Sunday. He'd bow his head and pray so hard. I can't believe those same hands." She trailed off, unable to finish. For days after his arrest, the town smelled faintly of smoke and wet earth. That farmhouse, the symbol of everything Plainfield wanted to forget, stood there, boarded up, guarded, and silent. Eventually, it would burn to the ground. But before that, investigators still had one more job: to step inside, to see, catalog and understand the true extent of what Ed Gein had created in his private museum of the macabre. And what they found inside would scar every one of them for life. When the first officers stepped into Ed Gein's farmhouse on that freezing November night, they didn't realize they were crossing a threshold, not into a home, but into the inside of one man's madness. Their flashlights swept across piles of garbage, tin cans, and newspaper clippings that carpeted the floor. The smell was suffocating, a mixture of mold, rot, and something far worse, something unmistakably human. Even seasoned hunters and deputies, men used to the sight of blood, could feel their stomachs twist. Every step they took revealed something more grotesque than the last. In the kitchen, they found an old pot-bellied stove. Beside it, a plastic bag containing Bernice Worden's heart. On the table lay a burlap sack. Inside was Bernice's head, her features barely recognizable. Someone had taken the time to clean and prepare it, as if it were part of some ritual. But it wasn't a ritual, it was a routine. As they continued, the flashlights caught things that made the men physically recoil. Chairs upholstered with tanned human skin, a wastebasket stitched from flesh, bowls carved out of skulls, smoothed and polished by hand, and hanging on the wall, like trophies, were what investigators called death masks, the preserved faces of women. Each one stared blankly back at them, hollow eyes and empty mouths, frozen in expressions of fear or calm, depending on how Ed had chosen to cut them. Some masks had lipstick on them. Others had traces of rouge, as if someone had tried to make them look alive again. On the floor of his bedroom closet, they found the woman's suit. It was made from the skin of multiple victims, stitched together carefully, complete with breasts and leggings. Ed had been crafting it piece by piece, a second skin he could wear. When questioned later, he said quietly, "I wanted to be her, to crawl into her skin." He meant his mother. Investigators described the atmosphere inside the house as inhuman. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as if the walls themselves carried the memory of what had happened there. Every object had a story, and each one told the same thing. Devotion twisted into delusion. The parlor, sealed for years, was spotless. It was Augusta's room, perfectly preserved. The curtains were still drawn, the furniture covered in a thin layer of dust, but untouched. Ed had kept it as a shrine to her, the only place in the entire house that wasn't corrupted by decay. Everywhere else, the chaos of his obsession filled the space. Magazines about headhunters and anatomy were stacked beside women's clothing. Shoeboxes filled with body parts, and bags of skin carefully salted to keep from rotting. One officer said later, "It felt like walking through someone's nightmares. You didn't want to touch anything because you knew it wasn't just furniture. It was people." The investigation inventory later confirmed what they found. 4 human noses in a cup, a belt made from female nipples, a lampshade made from the skin of a human face, 9 masks of skin stretched and dried, several skulls converted into bowls and decorations, the remains of at least 10 different women. Yet what haunted the officers most wasn't the gore. It was the order, the care. Nothing looked rushed. Nothing looked random. Everything had been arranged. On one of the tables lay a small journal, pages filled with odd drawings, faces, bodies, and notes about anatomy. The handwriting was neat, almost childlike. In one corner of the room, next to a pile of rags, was a small stack of women's clothing, dresses, corsets, stockings, all different sizes. When they lifted one of the skin masks, they noticed something strange. The inside was smooth and lined, not for display, but for wearing. That was when the full truth began to sink in. Ed Gein hadn't just collected his victims. He had tried to become them. He had turned his loneliness into creation, his grief into imitation, and his love for his mother into something monstrous, something that blurred the line between worship and possession. In the following days, photos from inside the house would never be shown to the public. Most were sealed in police archives, considered too disturbing for release. But those who saw them said the same thing. It didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like the inside of someone's mind that had rotted from the inside out. When they asked Ed about the skin lamps, the masks, the suit, he didn't show guilt. He simply said, "I just wanted to keep them near me." The psychiatrists who interviewed him later said that in his mind, Ed wasn't killing. He was rebuilding, trying to recreate the only person who ever made him feel safe, his mother, Augusta. But in doing so, he built something else entirely, a monument to madness, stitched from the remains of innocence and fear. When the door to Ed Gein's farmhouse finally closed, for the last time, investigators turned their attention to something even darker, the question of why. Why did a quiet, awkward man from a small Wisconsin town turn his home into a monument of death? For the next few weeks, the Waushara County Jail became a theater of silence. Reporters swarmed outside, while inside Ed sat alone, calm, polite, and strangely at ease. He didn't look like a killer. He didn't act like one. He spoke softly, using words like sir and ma'am, and even smiled when asked about his childhood. But when the questions turned to what he'd done, that same smile stayed. "I don't remember everything," he told investigators. "Sometimes I'd wake up and find things I didn't remember taking." He wasn't lying, at least, not entirely. 3 state psychiatrists were assigned to evaluate him. They concluded that Ed lived in a world that existed halfway between life and death, a place where his mother still spoke to him, where the dead were not truly gone, and where the line between memory and imagination had dissolved. They called it schizophrenia with psychosis. He called it loneliness. Ed told them that he'd often go into a trance after visiting the cemetery. He said he could feel his mother's spirit around him, guiding him toward certain graves. "She'd tell me which ones to take," he whispered to one doctor, as if confessing something sacred. The women he exhumed were always middle-aged, heavy-set, kind-faced, women who looked like Augusta. He told them he never meant harm. He wasn't trying to defile them. "I was just trying to keep them," he said. When asked about the skin suit, that grotesque creation pieced together from the bodies of the dead, Ed hesitated. Then he looked down and said quietly, "I wanted to be her, to feel what it was like." He denied being a cannibal. He denied enjoying violence. He insisted he never had relations with the bodies because, as he put it, They smelled too bad. But the truth was clear. Ed's obsession wasn't lust. It was love, twisted beyond recognition. He loved his mother so much that her death shattered him. And in his broken mind, he believed he could rebuild her from memory, from skin, from whatever the earth would give back. The doctors described his mental world as frozen grief. One psychiatrist later said, "He lived in a psychological winter. Nothing grew, nothing changed, just decay and devotion." When shown photos of what was found in his house, Ed showed no horror, no guilt, only mild surprise. "I guess I went too far," he said, almost to himself. He wasn't joking. The court ruled him legally insane and unfit for trial. He was sent to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, a place surrounded by barbed wire and silence. Inside, he adapted quickly. The nurses said he was a model patient, polite, cooperative, even helpful. He spent his days reading, sewing, and upholstering furniture. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Years later, one staff member said, "If you didn't know who he was, you'd think he was just another lonely old man." In the outside world, though, Ed's story became legend. Newspapers turned him into a monster. Writers and filmmakers transformed him into something larger than life. In 1959, a novelist named Robert Bloch wrote Psycho, inspired by Gein's quiet demeanor and obsession with his mother. Alfred Hitchcock brought it to the screen a year later, giving the world Norman Bates, a character whose soft voice and divided mind mirrored Ed's in every way. Then came the Texas Chain Saw Massacre in 1974, Leatherface, a brutal, silent killer who wore masks of human skin and lived in a house of bones. Later, The Silence of the Lambs introduced Buffalo Bill, another man who made a woman's suit. 3 killers, all born from one man's madness. And yet, when you strip away the fiction, the real Ed Gein wasn't the raging butcher those movies portrayed. He was quiet, shy, small. That's what made him so terrifying. He wasn't a predator who hunted at night. He was the neighbor who fixed your roof, smiled at your kids, and went home to a nightmare no one could imagine. When asked years later how such a thing could happen in Plainfield, one local said, "I guess we never really looked at him, not close enough." Ed Gein spent the rest of his life in institutions. He read, gardened, and kept to himself. He was rarely violent, rarely angry. When asked if he missed the outside world, he simply said, "I'm fine right here." He died in 1984 of lung cancer, 77 years old. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, the same ground he had once disturbed, not far from his mother's grave. The news broke quietly. The butcher of Plainfield dies at 77. No one attended his burial except a few hospital staff and a local undertaker. They lowered his coffin into the same cemetery where his victims once rested, the same soil he had disturbed so many nights under the moon. For years, people came to see the grave. They chipped away at the tombstone until nothing was left. Eventually, the authorities took it away, leaving the spot unmarked, just a patch of uneven grass among hundreds of others. If you visit Plainfield Cemetery today, you won't find his name, but you might feel something in the air, a strange heaviness, like the earth remembers. They say the grass above his plot grows slower, patchier than the rest. Maybe that's just the soil. Or maybe, in some way, the town itself still carries what happened there. What makes Ed Gein's story so terrifying isn't the gore, it's the normalcy. He wasn't a shadow in the alley or a face in the dark. He was a neighbor, a handyman, a man who smiled shyly when you said hello. He lived among ordinary people, buying groceries, helping on farms, attending church. All the while, the horrors of his home sat hidden behind locked doors, waiting to be found. That's the part that stays with you. Not the crimes themselves, but the quiet truth they reveal. That sometimes real monsters don't hide in the woods or wear masks. They sit beside you at the diner, invisible in their ordinariness. Ed Gein didn't just inspire horror movies, he redefined them. Because before him, monsters were fiction. After him, they were possible. And maybe that's why his story endures. Not because we want to relive it, but because it reminds us of how fragile normal life really is. How a single person, left alone too long in grief and darkness, can twist love into obsession and isolation into something unrecognizable. Every town has its secrets. Every person hides something. But Plainfield's secret was one the world would never forget. So when you drive through a small, silent town, past old farmhouses and empty fields, remember this story. Some doors stay locked for a reason. The wind hums softly as the camera fades from the farmhouse to the still fields of Wisconsin. This was the story of Ed Gein, the man who made his furniture out of women's skin and whose loneliness reshaped horror forever. If stories like this fascinate and disturb you as much as they do me, make sure you subscribe to Last Scene. I post real horror every week, true stories of the human mind at its darkest, where reality blurs into nightmare. Because sometimes the most terrifying things aren't made up. Static fades in. The sound of wind brushing over the empty fields lingers for a few seconds before silence.